Chapter 6 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 6. Literature, Historical, Anthropological. No one has yet attempted a complete history of inverted sexuality in all ages and in all races. This would be well worth doing. Materials, though not extremely plentiful, lie to hand in the religious books and codes of ancient nations, in mythology and poetry and literature, in narratives of travel, and the reports of observant explorers. Gibbon once suggested that a curious dissertation might be formed on the introduction of pederasty after the time of Homer, its progress among the Greeks of Asia and Europe, the vehemence of their passions, and the thin device of virtue and friendship which amused the philosophers of Athens. But, adds the prurient prude, Scelera ostendi oporteat dum puniuntur, abscondi flagitia. Two scholars responded to this call. The result is that the chapter on Greek love has been very fairly written by equally impartial, equally learned, and independent authors, who approached the subject from somewhat different points of view, but who arrived in the main at similar conclusions. The first of these histories is M.H.E. Meyer's article on Päderastie in Ersch and Gruber's Allgemeine Enzyklopädie, Leipzig, Brockhaus, 1837. The second is a treatise entitled A Problem in Greek Ethics, composed by an Englishman in English. The anonymous author was not acquainted with Meyer's article before he wrote, and only came across it long after he had printed his own essay. This work is extremely rare, 10 copies only having been impressed for private use. Inquirers into the psychology and morality of sexual inversion should not fail to study one or other of these treatises. It will surprise many a well-read scholar when he sees the whole list of Greek authorities and passages collected and coordinated, to find how thoroughly the manners and the literature of that great people were penetrated with paiderastia. The myths and heroic legends of prehistoric Hellas, the educational institutions of the Dorian state, the dialogues of Plato, the history of the Theban army, the biographies of innumerable eminent citizens, lawgivers and thinkers, governors and generals, founders of colonies and philosophers, poets and sculptors, render it impossible to maintain that this passion was either a degraded vice or a form of inherited neuropathy in the race to whom we owe so much of our intellectual heritage. Having surveyed the picture, we may turn aside to wonder whether modern European nations, imbued with the opinions I have described above in the section on vulgar errors, are wise in making Greek literature a staple of the higher education. Their motto is "Écraser l'infâme." Here the infamous thing clothes itself like an angel of light, and raises its forehead unabashed to heaven among the marble peristyles and olive groves of an unrivalled civilization. Another book written from a medical point of view is valuable upon the pathology of sexual inversion and cognate aberrations among the nations of antiquity. It bears the title Geschichte der Lustseuche im Alterthume, and is composed by Dr. Julius Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum attempts to solve the problem of the existence of syphilis and other venereal diseases in the remote past. This inquiry leads him to investigate the whole of Greek and Latin literature in its bearing upon sexual vice. Students will therefore expect from his pages no profound psychological speculations, and no idealistic presentation of an eminently repulsive subject. One of the most interesting chapters of his work is devoted to what Herodotus called nosos philea among the Scythians, a widespread effemination prevailing in a wild, warlike, and nomadic race. We have already alluded to Krafft Ebing's remarks on this disease, which has curious points of resemblance with some of the facts of male prostitution in modern cities. Professed anthropologists have dealt with the subject, collecting evidence from many quarters, and in some cases attempting to draw general conclusions. Bastian's Der Mensch der Geschichte and Herbert Spencer's Tables deserve special mention for their encyclopedic fullness of information regarding the distribution of abnormal sexuality and the customs of savage tribes. In England, an essay appended to the last volume of Sir Richard Burton's Arabian Nights made a considerable stir upon its first appearance. The author endeavoured to coordinate a large amount of miscellaneous matter, and to frame a general theory regarding the origin and prevalence of homosexual passions. His erudition, however, is incomplete, and though he possesses a copious store of anthropological details, he is not at the proper point of view for discussing the topic philosophically. For example, he takes for granted that pederasty, as he calls it, is everywhere and always what the vulgar think it. He seems to have no notion of the complicated psychology of Urnings, revealed to us by their recently published confessions in French and German medical and legal works. Still, his views deserve consideration. Burton regards the phenomenon as geographical and climatic, not racial. He summarises the result of his investigations in the following 5 conclusions. 1. There exists what I shall call a sotadic zone, bounded westwards by the northern shores of the Mediterranean, north latitude 43 degrees, and by the southern, north latitude 30 degrees. Thus the depth would be 780 to 800 miles, including meridional France, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and Greece, with the coast regions of Africa from Morocco to Egypt. 2. Running eastward, the sotadic zone narrows, embracing Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and Chaldea, Afghanistan, Sind, the Punjab, and Kashmir. 3. In Indochina, the belt begins to broaden, enfolding China, Japan, and Turkestan. 4. It then embraces the South Sea Islands and the New World, where at the time of its discovery sotadic love was, with some exceptions, an established racial institution. 5. Within the sotadic zone the vice is popular and endemic, held at the worst to be a mere peccadillo, while the races to the north and south of the limits here defined practise it only sporadically, amid the opprobrium of their fellows, who as a rule are physically incapable of performing the operation, and look upon it with the liveliest disgust. This is a curious and interesting generalisation, though it does not account for what history has transmitted regarding the customs of the Celts, Scythians, Bulgars, Tartars, Normans, and for the acknowledged leniency of modern Slavs to this form of vice. Burton advances an explanation of its origin. The only physical cause for the practice which suggests itself to me, and that must be owned to be purely conjectural, is that within the sotadic zone there is a blending of the masculine and feminine temperament, a crasis which elsewhere occurs only sporadically. So far as it goes, this suggestion rests upon ground admitted to be empirically sound by the medical writers we have already examined, and vehemently declared to be indisputable as a fact of physiology by Ulrichs, whom I shall presently introduce to my readers. But Burton makes no effort to account for the occurrence of this crasis of masculine and feminine temperaments in the sotatic zone at large, and for its sporadic appearance in other regions. Would it not be more philosophical to conjecture that the crasis, if that exists at all, takes place universally, but that the consequences are only tolerated in certain parts of the globe, which he defines as the sotatic zone? Ancient Greece and Rome permitted them. Modern Greece and Italy have excluded them to the same extent as Northern European nations. North and South America, before the Conquest, saw no harm in them. Since its colonisation by Europeans, they have been discountenanced. The phenomenon cannot therefore be regarded as specifically geographical and climatic. Besides, there is one fact mentioned by Burton which ought to make him doubt his geographical theory. He says that after the conquest of Algiers, the French troops were infected to an enormous extent by the habits they had acquired there, and from them it spread so far and wide into civilian society that the vice may be said to have been democratised in cities and large towns. This surely proves that north of the sotatic zone males are neither physically incapable of the acts involved in abnormal passion, nor gifted with an insuperable disgust for them. Law, and the public opinion generated by law and religious teaching, have been deterrent causes in those regions. The problem is therefore not geographical and climatic, but social. Again, may it not be suggested that the absence of the vice among the Negroes and Negroid races of South Africa, noticed by Burton, is due to their excellent customs of sexual initiation and education at the age of puberty, customs which it is the shame of modern civilization to have left unimitated? However this may be, Burton regards the instinct as natural, not contre nature, and says that its patients deserve not prosecution, but the pitiful care of the physician and the study of the psychologist. Another distinguished anthropologist, Paulo Mantegazza, has devoted special attention to the physiology and psychology of what he calls i pervertimenti dell'amore, starting with the vulgar error that all sexual inversion implies the unmentionable act of coition, for which, by the way, he is severely rebuked by Krafft-Ebing, Psychopathia Sexualis, page 92. He explains anomalous passions by supposing that the nerves of pleasurable sensation, which ought to be carried to the genital organs, are in some cases carried to the rectum. This malformation makes its subject desire coitum per anum. That an intimate connection exists between the nerves of the reproductive organs and the nerves of the rectum is known to anatomists and is felt by everybody. Probably some Cinaidi are excited voluptuously in the mode suggested. Seneca in his epistles records such cases, and it is difficult in any other way to account for the transports felt by male prostitutes of the Weibling type. Finally, writers upon female prostitution mention women who are incapable of deriving pleasure from any sexual act except aversa Venus. Mantegazza's observation deserves to be remembered, and ought to be tested by investigation. But it is obvious he pushes the corollary he draws from it as to the prevalence of sexual inversion too far. He distinguishes three classes of sodomy. 1. Peripheric or anatomical, caused by an unusual distribution of the nerves passing from the spine to the reproductive organs and the rectum. 2. Psychical, which he describes as specific to intelligent men, cultivated and frequently neurotic, but which he does not attempt to elucidate, though he calls it not a vice but a passion. 3. Luxurious or lustful, when the aversa Venus is deliberately chosen on account of what Mantegazza terms la desolante larghezza of the female. Mantegazza winds up, like Burton, by observing that sodomy, studied with the pitying and indulgent eye of the physician and the physiologist, is consequently a disease which claims to be cured, and can in many cases be cured. After perusing what physicians, historians, and anthropologists have to say about sexual inversion, there is good reason for us to feel uneasy as to the present condition of our laws. And yet it might be argued that anomalous desires are not always maladies, not always congenital, not always psychical passions. In some cases they must surely be vices deliberately adopted out of lustfulness, wanton curiosity, and seeking after sensual refinements. The difficult question still remains, then, how to repress vice without acting unjustly towards the naturally abnormal, the unfortunate, and the irresponsible. I pass now to the polemical writings of a man who maintains that homosexual passions, even in their vicious aspects, ought not to be punished except in the same degree and under the same conditions as the normal passions of the majority. End of chapter 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 7 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 7. Literature Polemical. Part 1. It can hardly be said that inverted sexuality received a serious and sympathetic treatment until a German jurist named Karl Heinrich Ulrichs began his long warfare against what he considered to be prejudice and ignorance upon a topic of the greatest moment to himself. A native of Hanover, and writing at first under the assumed name of Numa Numantius, he kept pouring out a series of polemical, analytical, theoretical, and apologetical pamphlets between the years 1864 and 1870. The most important of these works is a lengthy and comprehensive essay entitled Memnon, Die Geschlechtsnatur des mannliebenden Urnings, eine naturwissenschaftliche Darstellung. Schleiz, 1868. Memnon may be used as the textbook of its author's theories, but it is also necessary to study earlier and later treatises, Inclusa, Formatrix, Vindex, Ara Spei, Gladius Furens, Incubus, Argonauticus, Prometheus, Araxes, kritische Pfeile, in order to obtain a complete knowledge of his opinions, and to master the whole mass of information he has brought together. The object of Ulrichs in these miscellaneous writings is twofold. He seeks to establish a theory of sexual inversion upon the basis of natural science, proving that abnormal instincts are inborn and healthy in a considerable percentage of human beings, that they do not owe their origin to bad habits of any kind, to hereditary disease, or to wilful depravity; that they are incapable, in the majority of cases, of being extirpated or converted into normal channels; and that the men subject to them are neither physically, intellectually, nor morally inferior to normally constituted individuals. Having demonstrated these points to his own satisfaction, and supported his views with a large induction of instances and a respectable show of erudition, he proceeds to argue that the present state of the law in many states of Europe is flagrantly unjust to a class of innocent persons, who may indeed be regarded as unfortunate and inconvenient, but who are guilty of nothing which deserves reprobation and punishment. In this second and polemical branch of his exposition, Ulrichs assumes, for his juristic starting point, that each human being is born with natural rights, which legislation ought not to infringe but protect. He does not attempt to confute the utilitarian theory of jurisprudence, which regards laws as regulations made by the majority in the supposed interests of society. Yet a large amount of his reasoning is designed to invalidate utilitarian arguments in favour of repression, by showing that no social evil ensues in those countries which have placed abnormal sexuality upon the same footing as the normal, and that the toleration of inverted passion threatens no danger to the well-being of nations. After this prelude, an abstract of Ulrichs' theory and his pleading may be given, deduced from the comparative study of his numerous essays. The right key to the solution of the problem is to be found in physiology, in that obscure department of natural science which deals with the evolution of sex. The embryo, as we are now aware, contains an undetermined element of sex during the first months of pregnancy. This is gradually worked up into male and female organs of procreation; and these, when the age of puberty arrives, are generally accompanied by corresponding male and female appetites. That is to say, the man in an immense majority of cases desires the woman, and the woman desires the man. Nature, so to speak, aims at differentiating the undecided fetus into a human being of one or the other sex, the propagation of the species being the main object of life. Still, as Aristotle puts it, and as we observe in many of her operations, nature wishes, but has not always the power. Refusis bulletae men alludinatae. Consequently, in respect of physical structure, there come to light imperfect individuals, so-called hermaphrodites, whose sexual apparatus is so far undetermined that many a real male has passed a portion of his life under a mistake, has worn female clothes, and has cohabited by preference with men. Likewise, in respect of spiritual nature, there appear males who, notwithstanding their marked masculine organisation, feel from the earliest childhood a sexual proclivity towards men, with a corresponding indifference for women. In some of these abnormal but natural beings, The appetite for men resembles the normal appetite of men for women. In others it resembles the normal appetite of women for men. That is to say, some prefer effeminate males, dressed in feminine clothes, and addicted to feminine occupations. Others prefer powerful adults of an ultra-masculine stamp. A third class manifest their predilection for healthy young men in the bloom of adolescence, between 19 and 20. The attitude of such persons towards women also varies. In genuine cases of inborn sexual inversion, a positive horror is felt when the woman has to be carnally known, and this horror is of the same sort as that which normal men experience when they think of cohabitation with a male. In others, the disinclination does not amount to repugnance, but the abnormal man finds considerable difficulty in stimulating himself to the sexual act with females, and derives a very imperfect satisfaction from the same. A certain type of man, in the last place, seems to be indifferent, desiring males at one time and females at another. In order to gain clearness in his exposition, Ulrichs has invented names for these several species. The so-called hermaphrodite he dismisses with the German designation of Zwitter. Imperfect individuals of this type are not to be considered, because it is well known that the male or female organs are never developed in one and the same body. It is also, as we shall presently discover, an essential part of his theory to regard the problem of inversion psychologically. The normal man he calls Dioning, the abnormal man Urning. Among Urnings, those who prefer effeminate males are christened by the name of Mannling. Those who prefer powerful and masculine adults receive the name of Weibling. The Urning who cares for adolescents is styled a Zwischenurning. Men who seem to be indifferently attracted by both sexes he calls Uranodioninge. A genuine Dioning, who from lack of women, or under the influence of special circumstances, consorts with persons of his own sex, is denominated Uraniaster. A genuine Urning, who has put restraint upon his inborn impulse, who has forced himself to cohabit with women, or has perhaps contracted marriage, is said to be virilisiert, a virilized Urning. These outlandish names, though seemingly pedantic and superfluous, have their technical value, and are necessary to the understanding of Ulrichs' system. He is dealing exclusively with individuals classified by common parlance as males, without distinction. Ulrichs believes that he can establish a real natural division between men proper, whom he calls Dioninge, and males of an anomalous sexual development, whom he calls Urninge. Having proceeded so far, he finds the necessity of distinguishing three broad types of the Urning, and of making out the crosses between Urning and Dioning, of which he also finds three species. It will appear in the sequel that whatever may be thought about his psychological hypothesis, the nomenclature he has adopted is useful in discussion, and corresponds to well-defined phenomena, of which we have abundant information. The following table will make his analysis sufficiently plain. Left column. The human male. 1. Man or Dioning. Subdivisions: Uraniaster, when he has acquired the tastes of the Urning. Division 2. Urning. Subdivisions: Mannling, Weibling, Zwischenurning, virilized Urning. Division 3. uranodioning. Division 4, hermaphrodite. Broadly speaking, the male includes two main species, dioning and urning, men with normal and men with abnormal instincts. What then constitutes the distinction between them? How are we justified in regarding them as radically divergent? Ulrich replies that the phenomenon of sexual inversion is to be explained by physiology, and particularly by the evolution of the embryo. Nature fails to complete her work regularly and in every instance. Having succeeded in differentiating a male with full-formed sexual organs from the undecided fetus, she does not always effect the proper differentiation of that portion of the psychical being in which resides the sexual appetite. There remains a female soul in a male body. Anima muliebris virili corpore inclusa is the formula adopted by Ulrichs, and he quotes a passage from the Vestiges of Creation, which suggests that a male is a more advanced product of sexual evolution than the female. The male instinct of sex is a more advanced product than the female instinct. Consequently, men appear whose body has been differentiated as masculine, but whose sexual instinct has not progressed beyond the feminine stage. Ulrichs' own words ought to be cited upon this fundamental part of his hypothesis, since he does not adopt the opinion that the Urning is a Dioning arrested at a certain point of development, but rather that there is an element of uncertainty attending the simultaneous evolution of physical and psychical factors from the indeterminate ground stuff. Sex, says he, is only an affair of development. Up to a certain stage of embryonic existence, all living mammals are hermaphroditic. A certain number of them advance to the condition of what I call man, Dioning, others to what I call woman, Dioningin. A third class become what I call Urning, including Urningin. It ensues therefrom that between these three sexes there are no primary, but only secondary differences, and yet true differences constituting sexual species exist as facts. Man, woman, and Urning, the third being either a male or a female in whom we observe a real and inborn, not an acquired or a spurious, inversion of appetite, are consequently regarded by him as the three main divisions of humanity, viewed from the point of view of sex. The embryonic ground stuff in the case of each was homologous, but while the two former, man and woman, have been normally differentiated, the Urning's sexual instinct, owing to some imperfection in the process of development, does not correspond to his or her sexual organs. The line of division between the sexes, even in adult life, is a subtle one, and the physical structure of men and women yields indubitable signs of their emergence from a common ground stuff. Perfect men have rudimentary breasts. Perfect women carry a rudimentary penis in their clitoris. The raphe of the scrotum shows where the aperture, common at first to masculine and feminine beings, but afterwards only retained in the female vulva, was closed up to form a male. Other anatomical details of the same sort might be adduced. But these will suffice to make thinking persons reflect upon the mysterious dubiety of what we call sex. That gradual development which ends in normal differentiation goes on very slowly. It is only at the age of puberty that a boy distinguishes himself abruptly from a girl, by changing his voice and growing hair on parts of the body where it is not usually found in women. This being so, it is surely not surprising that the sexual appetite should sometimes fail to be normally determined, or in other words should be inverted. Ulrich maintains that the body of an Urning is masculine, his soul feminine, so far as sex is concerned. Accordingly, though physically unfitted for coition with men, he is imperatively drawn towards them by a natural impulse. Opponents meet him with this objection: your position is untenable. Body and soul constitute one inseparable entity. So they do, replies Ulrich, but the way in which these factors of the person are combined in human beings differs extremely, as I can prove by indisputable facts. The body of a male is visible to the eyes, is mensurable and ponderable, is clearly marked in its specific organs. But what we call his soul, his passions, inclinations, sensibilities, emotional characteristics, sexual desires, eludes the observation of the senses. This second factor, like the first, existed in the undetermined stages of the fetus. And when I find that the soul, this element of instinct and emotion and desire existing in a male, had been directed in its sexual appetite from earliest boyhood towards persons of the male sex, I have the right to qualify it with the attribute of femininity. You assume that soul sex is indissolubly connected and inevitably derived from body sex. The facts contradict you, as I can prove by referring to the veracious autobiographies of Urnings, and to known phenomena regarding them. End of Chapter 7, Part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 7, Part 2 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 7, Literature, Polemical, Part 2. Such is the theory of Ulrichs, and though we may not incline to his peculiar mode of explaining the want of harmony between sexual organs and sexual appetite in Urnings, there can be no doubt that in some way or other their eccentric diathesis must be referred to the obscure process of sexual differentiation. Perhaps he antedates the moment at which the aberration sometimes takes its origin, not accounting sufficiently for imperative impressions made on the imagination or the senses of boys during the years which precede puberty. However this may be, the tendency to such inversion is certainly inborn in an extremely large percentage of cases. That can be demonstrated from the reports of persons whose instincts were directed to the male before they knew what sex meant. It is worth extracting passages from these confessions. 1. As a schoolboy of 8 years, I sat near a comrade rather older than myself, and how happy was I when he touched me! That was the first indefinite perception of an inclination which remained a secret for me till my 19th year. 2. Going back to my 7th year, I had a lively feeling for a schoolfellow 2 years older than myself. I was happy when I could be as close as possible to him, and in our games could place my head near to his private parts. 3. At 10 years of age he had a romantic attachment for a comrade, and the passion for people of his own sex became always more and more marked. 4. Another confessed that already at the age of 4 he used to dream of handsome grooms. 5. A fifth said, "My passion for people of my own sex awoke at the age of 8. I used to enjoy my brother's nakedness. While bathing with other children, I took no interest at all in girls, but felt the liveliest attraction towards boys." 6. A sixth dates his experience from his 6th or 7th year. 7. A seventh remembers that, while yet a boy, before the age of puberty, sleeping in the company of a male agitated him to such an extent that he lay for hours awake. 8. An eighth relates that, while 3 years old, I got possession of a fashion book, cut out the pictures of men, and kissed them to tatters. The pictures of women I did not care to look at. 9. A ninth goes back to his 13th year and a school friendship. 10. A 10th records the same about his 7th year. 11. An 11th says that his inverted instincts awoke in early childhood, and that from his 9th year onward he fell over and over again in love with adult men. 12. A 12th spoke as follows: "So far back as I can remember, I was always subject to this passion. Quite as a child, young men made deeper impression on me than women or girls. The earliest sensual perturbation of which I have any recollection was excited by a tutor, when I was 9 or 10, and my greatest pleasure was to be allowed to ride astride upon his leg." 13. A 13th: "From the earliest childhood I have been haunted by visions of men, and only of men. Never has a woman exercised the least influence over me. At school I kept these instincts to myself, and lived quite retired." 14. A 14th can recollect receiving a distinctly sensual impression at the age of 4, when the manservants caressed him. 15. A 15th says that at the age of 13, together with puberty, the inversion of appetite awoke in him. 16. A 16th confesses that he felt an unconquerable desire for soldiers in his 13th year. 17. A 17th remembers having always dreamed only of men, and at school, he says, "When my comrades looked at pretty girls and criticised them during our daily promenades, I could not comprehend how they found anything to admire in such creatures." On the other hand, the sight and touch of soldiers and strong fellows excited him enormously. 18. An 18th dates the awakening of passion in him at the age of 11, when he saw a handsome man in church, and from that time forward his instinct never altered. 19. A 19th fell in love with an officer at the age of 13, and since then always desired vigorous adult males. 20. A 20th confessed to have begun to love boys of his own age, sensually, while only 8 years of age. 21. A 21st records that when he was 8 he began to crave after the sight of naked men. In addition to these cases, a great many might be culled from the writings of Ulrichs, who has published a full account from his own early experience. "I was 15 years and 10½ months old," he says, "when the first erotic dream announced the arrival of puberty. Never before that period had I known sexual gratification of any kind whatever. The occurrence was therefore wholly normal. From a much earlier time, however, I had been subject to emotions, partly romantic, partly sensual, without any definite desire, and never for one and the same young man. These aimless yearnings of the senses plagued me in my solitary hours, and I could not overcome them. During my 15th year, while at school at Detmold, the vague longing look took a twofold shape. First, I came across Normann's Säulenordnungen, and there I was vehemently attracted by the figure of a Greek god or hero, standing in naked beauty. Secondly, while studying in my little room, or before going to sleep, the thought used suddenly and irresistibly to rise up in my mind: if only a soldier would clamber through the window and come into my room. I then painted in my fancy the picture of a splendid soldier of 20 to 22 years old, and yet I had no definite idea of why I wanted him, nor had I ever come into contact with soldiers. About 2 years after this, I happened to sit next a soldier in a post-carriage. The contact with his thigh excited me to the highest degree. Ulrichs also relates that in his 10th year he conceived an enthusiastic and romantic friendship for a boy 2 years his senior. That experiences of the kind are very common, every one who has at all conversed with Urnings knows well. From private sources of unquestionable veracity, these may be added. A relates that before 8 years old reverie occurred to him during the day and dreams at night of naked sailors. When he began to study Latin and Greek, he dreamed of young gods, and at the age of 14 became deeply enamoured of the photograph of the Praxitelian Eros in the Vatican. He had a great dislike for physical contact with girls, and with boys was shy and reserved, indulging in no acts of sense. B says that during his tenderest boyhood, long before the age of puberty, he fell in love with a young shepherd on one of his father's farms, for whom he was so enthusiastic that the man had to be sent to a distant moor. C, at the same early age, conceived a violent affection for a footman. D for an officer who came to stay at his home. E for the bridegroom of his eldest sister. In nearly all the cases here cited, the inverted sexual instinct sprang up spontaneously. Only a few of the autobiographies record seduction by an elder man as the origin of the affection. In none of them was it ever wholly overcome. Only 5 out of the 27 men married. 20 declare that, tortured by the sense of their dissimilarity to other males, haunted by shame and fear, they forced themselves to frequent public women soon after the age of puberty. Some found themselves impotent. Others succeeded in accomplishing their object with difficulty, or by means of evoking the images of men on whom their affections were set. All except one concur in emphatically asserting the superior attraction which men have always exercised for them over women. Women leave them, if not altogether disgusted, yet cold and indifferent. Men rouse their strongest sympathies and instincts. The one exception just alluded to is what Ulrichs would call an Uranodioning. The others are capable of friendship with women. some even of aesthetic admiration, and the tenderest regard for them, but not of genuine sexual desire. Their case is literally an inversion of the ordinary. End of chapter 7, part 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 7 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 7. Literature Polemical. Part 3. Some observations may be made on Ulrichs' theory. It is now recognised by the leading authorities, medical and medico-juristic, in Germany, by writers like Caspar Lehmann and Krafft Ebing, that sexual inversion is more often than not innate. So far, without discussing the physiological or metaphysical explanations of this phenomenon, without considering whether Ulrichs is right in his theory of anima muliebris inclusa in corpore virili, or whether heredity, insanity, and similar general conditions are to be held responsible for the fact, it may be taken as admitted on all sides that the sexual diathesis in question is in a very large number of instances congenital. But Ulrichs seems to claim too much for the position he has won. He ignores the frequency of acquired habits. He shuts his eyes to the force of fashion and depravity. He reckons men like Horace and Ovid and Catullus among the ancients, who were clearly indifferent in their tastes, and indifferent as the modern Turks, to the account of Uranodionings. In one word, he is so enthusiastic for his physiological theory that he overlooks all other aspects of the question. Nevertheless, he has acquired the right to an impartial hearing, while pleading in defence of those who are acknowledged by all investigators of the problem to be the subjects of an inborn misplacement of the sexual appetite. Let us turn, then, to the consideration of his arguments in favour of freeing Urnings from the terrible legal penalties to which they are at present subject, and, if this were possible, from the no less terrible social condemnation to which they are exposed by the repugnance they engender in the normally constituted majority. Dealing with these exceptions to the kindly race of men and women, these unfortunates who have no family ties knotted by bonds of mutual love, no children to expect, no reciprocity of passion to enjoy. Mankind, says Ulrichs, has hitherto acted just in the same way as a herd of deer acts, when it drives the sickly and the weakly out to die in solitude, burdened with contumely and cut off from common sympathy. From the point of view of morality and law, he argues, it does not signify whether we regard the sexual inversion of an Urning as morbid or as natural. He has become what he is in the dawn and first emergence of emotional existence. You may contend that he derives perverted instincts from his ancestry, that he is the subject of a psychical disorder, that from the cradle he is predestined by atavism or disease to misery. I maintain that he is one of nature's sports, a creature healthy and well organised, evolved in her superb indifference to aberrations from the normal type. We need not quarrel over our solutions of the problem. The fact that he is there among us, and that he constitutes an ever-present factor in our social system, has to be faced. How are we to deal with him? Has society the right to punish individuals sent into the world with homosexual instincts? Putting the question at its lowest point, admitting that these persons are the victims of congenital morbidity, ought they to be treated as criminals? It is established that their appetites, being innate, are to them at least natural and undepraved. The common appetites, being excluded from their sexual scheme, are to them unnatural and abhorrent. Ought not such beings, instead of being hunted down and persecuted by legal bloodhounds, to be regarded with pitying solicitude as among the most unfortunate of human beings, doomed as they are to inextinguishable longings and lifelong deprivation of that which is the chief prize of man's existence on this planet, a reciprocated love? As your laws at present stand, you include all cases of sexual inversion under the one denomination of crime. You make exceptions in some special instances, and treat the men involved as lunatics. But the Urning is neither criminal nor insane. He is only less fortunate than you are, through an accident of birth, which is at present obscure to our imperfect science of sexual determination. So far Ulrichs is justified in his pleading. When it has been admitted that sexual inversion is usually a fact of congenital diathesis, the criminal law stands in no logical relation to the phenomenon. It is monstrous to punish people as wilfully wicked, because, having been born with the same organs and the same appetites as their neighbours, they are doomed to suffer under the frightful disability of not being able to use their organs or to gratify their appetites in the ordinary way. But here arises a difficulty which cannot be ignored, since upon it is based the only valid excuse for the position taken up by society in dealing with this matter. Not all men and women possessed by abnormal sexual desires can claim that these are innate. It is certain that the habits of sodomy are frequently acquired under conditions of exclusion from the company of persons of the other sex, as in public schools, barracks, prisons, convents, ships. In some cases they are deliberately adopted by natures tired of normal sexual pleasure. They may even become fashionable and epidemic. Lastly, it is probable that curiosity and imitation communicate them to otherwise normal individuals at a susceptible moment of development. Therefore society has the right to say, those who are the unfortunate subjects of inborn sexual inversion shall not be allowed to indulge their passions, lest the mischief should spread, and a vicious habit should contaminate our youth. From the utilitarian point of view, society is justified in protecting itself against a minority of exceptional beings, whom it regards as pernicious to the general welfare. From any point of view, the majority is strong enough to coerce to inborn instincts, and to trample on the anguish of a few unfortunates. But, asks Ulrichs, is this consistent with humanity? Is it consistent with the august ideal of impartial equity? Are people sound in body, vigorous in mind, wholesome in habit, capable of generous affections, good servants of the state, trustworthy in all the ordinary relations of life, to be condemned at law as criminals because they cannot feel sexually as the majority feel, because they find some satisfaction for their inborn want in ways which the majority dislike? Seeking a solution of the difficulty stated in the foregoing paragraph, Ulrichs finds it in fact and history. His answer is that if society leaves nature to take her course, with the abnormal as well as with the normal subjects of sexual inclination, society will not suffer. In countries where legal penalties have been removed from inverted sexuality, where this is placed upon the same footing as the normal, in France, Bavaria, the Netherlands, no inconvenience has hitherto arisen. There has ensued no sudden and flagrant outburst of a depraved habit, no dissemination of a spreading moral poison. On the other hand, in countries where these penalties exist and are enforced, in England, for example, and in the metropolis of England, London, inverted sexuality runs riot, despite of legal prohibitions, despite of threats of prison, dread of exposure, and the intolerable pest of organised chantage. End of Chapter 7, Part 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 7 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 7. Literature, Polemical. Part 4. In the eyes of Ulrichs, society is engaged in sitting on a safety valve, which, if nature were allowed to operate unhindered, would do society no harm, but rather good. The majority, he thinks, are not going to become Urnings, for the simple reason that they have not the unhappy constitution of the Urning. Cease to persecute Urnings, accept them as inconsiderable yet real factors in the social commonwealth, leave them to themselves, and you will not be the worse for it, and will also not carry on your conscience the burden of intolerant vindictiveness. Substantiating this position, Ulrichs demonstrates that acquired habits of sexual inversion are almost invariably thrown off by normal natures. Your boys at public schools, he says, behave as though they were Urnings. In the lack of women, at the time when their passions are predominant, they yield themselves up together to mutual indulgences, which would bring your laws down with terrible effect upon adults. You are aware of this. You send your sons to Eton and to Harrow, and you know very well what goes on there. Yet you remain untroubled in your minds. And why? Because you feel convinced that they will return to their congenital instincts. When the school, the barrack, the prison, the ship, has been abandoned, the male reverts to the female. This is the truth about Dionings. The large majority of men and women remain normal, simply because they were made normal. They cannot find the satisfaction of their nature in those inverted practices to which they yielded for a time through want of normal outlet. Society risks little by the occasional caprice of the school, the barrack, the prison, and the ship. Some genuine Urnings may indeed discover their inborn inclination by means of the process to which you subject them. But you are quite right in supposing that a Dioning, though you have forced him to become for a time an Uraniaster, will never in the long run appear as an Urning. The extensive experience which English people possess regarding such matters, owing to the notorious condition of their public schools, goes to confirm Ulrichs' position. Headmasters know how many Uraniasters they have dealt with, what excellent Dionings they become, and how comparatively rare, and yet how incorrigibly steadfast, are the genuine Urnings in their flock. The upshot of this matter is that we are continually forcing our young men into conditions under which, if sexual inversion were an acquired attribute, it would become stereotyped in their natures. Yet it does not do so. Provisionally, because they are shut off from girls, because they find no other outlet for their sex at the moment of its most imperious claims, they turn toward males, and treat their younger schoolfellows in ways which would consign an adult to penal servitude. They are Uraniasters by necessity and faute de mieux. But no sooner are they let loose upon the world than the majority revert to normal channels. They pick up women in the streets and form connections, as the phrase goes. Some undoubtedly, in this fiery furnace through which they have been passed, discover their inborn sexual inversion. Then, when they cannot resist the ply of their proclivity, you condemn them as criminals in their later years. Is that just? Would it not be better to revert from our civilization to the manners of the savage man, to initiate youths into the mysteries of sex, and to give each in his turn the chance of developing a normal instinct by putting him, during his time of puberty, freely and frankly to the female? If you abhor Urnings, as you surely do, you are at least responsible for their mishap by the extraordinary way in which you bring them up. At all events, when they develop into the eccentric beings which they are, you are the last people in the world who have any right to punish them with legal penalties and social obloquy. Considering the present state of the law in most countries to be inequitable towards a respectable minority of citizens, Ulrichs proposes that Urnings should be placed upon the same footing as other men. That is to say, sexual relations between males and males should not be treated as criminal, unless they be attended with violence, as in the case of rape, or be carried on in such a way as to offend the public sense of decency in places of general resort or on the open street; or thirdly, be entertained between an adult and a boy under age, the protected age to be decided, as in the case of girls. What he demands is that when an adult male, freely and of his own consent, complies with the proposals of an adult person of his own sex, and their intercourse takes place with due regard for public decency, neither party shall be liable to prosecution and punishment at law. In fact, he would be satisfied with the same conditions as those prevalent in France, and since June 1889 in Italy. If so much were conceded by the majority of normal people to the abnormal minority, continues Ulrichs, an immense amount of misery and furtive vice would be at once abolished, and it is difficult to conceive what evil results would follow. A defender of the present laws of England, Prussia, etc., might indeed reply: "This is opening a free way to the seduction and corruption of young men." But young men are surely at least as capable of defending themselves against seduction and corruption as young women are; nay, they are far more able, not merely because they are stronger, but because they are not usually weakened by an overpowering sexual instinct on which the seducer plays. Yet the seduction and corruption of young women is tolerated, in spite of the attendant consequences of illegitimate childbirth, and all which that involves. This toleration of the seduction of women by men springs from the assumption that only the normal sexual appetite is natural. The seduction of a man by a male passes for criminal, because the inverted sexual instinct is regarded as unnatural, depraved, and wilfully perverse. On the hypothesis that individuals subject to perverted instincts can suppress them at pleasure, or convert them into normal appetite, it is argued that they must be punished. But when the real facts come to be studied, it will be found, first, that these instincts are inborn in Urnings, and are therefore in their case natural. Secondly, that the suppression of them is tantamount to lifelong abstinence under the constant torture of sexual solicitation. Thirdly, that the conversion of them into normal channels is in a large percentage of cases totally impossible. In nearly all where it has been attempted is only partially successful, and where marriage ensues has generally ended in misery for both parties. Ulrichs, it will be noticed, does not distinguish between Urnings, in whom the inversion is admitted to be congenital, and Uraniasters, in whom it has been acquired or deliberately adopted. And it would be very difficult to frame laws which should take cognizance of these two classes. The Code Napoleon legalises the position of both, theoretically at any rate. The English Code treats both as criminal, doing thereby, it must be admitted, marked injustice to recognised Urnings, who at the worst are morbid or insane, or sexually deformed, through no fault of their own. In the present state of things, adds Ulrichs, the men who yield their bodies to abnormal lovers do not merely do so out of compliance, sympathy, or the desire for reasonable reward. Too often they speculate upon the illegality of the connection, and have their main object in the extortion of money by threats of exposure. Thus the very basest of all trades, that of chantage, is encouraged by the law. Alter the law, and instead of increasing vice you will diminish it. For a man who should then meet the advances of an Urning would do so out of compliance, or, as is the case with female prostitutes, upon the expectation of a reasonable gain. The temptation to ply a disgraceful profession with the object of extorting money would be removed. Moreover, as regards individuals alike abnormally constituted, voluntary and mutually satisfying relations free from degrading risks, and possibly permanent, might be formed between responsible agents. Finally, if it be feared that the removal of legal disabilities would turn the whole male population into Urnings, consider whether London is now so much purer in this respect than Paris. One serious objection to recognising and tolerating sexual inversion has always been that it tends to check the population. This was a sound political and social argument in the time of Moses, when a small and militant tribe needed to multiply to the full extent of its procreative capacity. It is by no means so valid in our age, when the habitable portions of the globe are rapidly becoming overcrowded. Moreover, we must bear in mind that society under the existing order sanctions female prostitution, whereby men and women, the normally procreative, are sterilised to an indefinite extent. Logic, in these circumstances, renders it inequitable and ridiculous to deny a sterile exercise of sex to abnormal men and women, who are by instinct and congenital diathesis non-procreative. As the result of these considerations, Ulrichs concludes that there is no real ground for the persecution of Urnings, except as may be found in the repugnance by the vast numerical majority for an insignificant minority. the majority encourages matrimony, condones seduction, sanctions prostitution, legalizes divorce in the interests of its own sexual proclivities. It makes temporary or permanent unions illegal for the minority whose inversion of instinct it abhors. And this persecution, in the popular mind at any rate, is justified, like many other inequitable acts of prejudice or ignorance, by theological assumptions and the so-called mandates of revelation. In the next place, it is objected that inversed sexuality is demoralising to the manhood of a nation, that it degrades the dignity of a man, and that it is incapable of moral elevation. Each of these points may be taken separately. They are all of them at once and together contradicted by the history of ancient Greece. There the most warlike sections of the race, the Dorians of Crete and Sparta, and the Thebans, organised the love of male for male, because of the social and military advantages they found in it. Their annals abound in eminent instances of heroic enthusiasm, patriotic devotion, and high living, inspired by homosexual passion. The fighting peoples of the world, Celts in ancient story, Normans, Turks, Afghans, Albanians, Tartars, have been distinguished by the frequency among them of what popular prejudice regards as an effeminate vice. End of Chapter 7, Part 4. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 7 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. With regard to the dignity of man, is there, asks Ulrichs, anything more degrading to humanity in sexual acts performed between male and male than in similar acts performed between male and female? In a certain sense, all sex has an element of grossness which inspires repugnance. The gods, says Swinburne, have strewed one marriage bed with tears and fire, for extreme loathing and supreme desire. It would not be easy to maintain that a curate begetting his 14th baby on the body of a worn-out wife is a more elevating object of mental contemplation than Harmodius in the embrace of Aristogeiton, or that a young man sleeping with a prostitute picked up in the Haymarket is cleaner than his brother sleeping with a soldier picked up in the park. Much of this talk about the dignity of man, says Ulrichs, proceeds from a vulgar misconception as to the nature of inverted sexual desire. People assume that Urnings seek their pleasure only or mainly in an act of unmentionable indecency. The exact opposite, he assures them, is the truth. The act in question is no commoner between men and men than it is between men and women. Ulrichs, upon this point, may be suspected, perhaps, as an untrustworthy witness. His testimony, however, is confirmed by Krafft Ebing, who, as we have seen, has studied sexual inversion long and minutely from the point of view of psychical pathology. As regards the nature of their sexual gratification, he writes, it must be established at the outset that the majority of them are contented with reciprocal embraces. The act commonly ascribed to them they generally abhor as much as normal men do, and inasmuch as they always prefer adults, they are in no sense specially dangerous to boys. This author proceeds to draw a distinction between Urnings in whom sexual inversion is congenital, and old debauchees or half-idiotic individuals who are in the habit of misusing boys. The vulgar have confounded two different classes, and everybody who studies the psychology of Urnings is aware that this involves a grave injustice to the latter. But after all, continues the objector, you cannot show that inverted sexuality is capable of any moral elevation. Without appealing to antiquity, the records of which confute this objection overwhelmingly, one might refer to the numerous passages in Ulrich's writings where he relates the fidelity, loyalty, self-sacrifice, and romantic enthusiasm which frequently accompany such loves, and raises them above baseness. But since here again he may be considered a suspicious witness, it will suffice as before to translate a brief passage from Krafft Ebing. The Urning loves, idolizes his friend quite as much as the normal man loves and idolizes his girl. He is capable of making for him the greatest sacrifices. He suffers the pangs of unhappy, often unreturned affection, feels jealousy, mourns under the fear of his friend's infidelity. When the time comes for speaking about Walt Whitman's treatment of this topic, it will appear that the passion of a man for his comrade has been idealized in fact and deed, as well as in poetry. For the present, it is enough to remark that a kind of love, however spontaneous and powerful, which is scouted, despised, tabooed, banned, punished, relegated to holes and corners, cannot be expected to show its best side to the world. The sense of sin and crime and danger, the humiliation and repression and distress to which the unfortunate pariahs of inverted sexuality are daily and hourly exposed, must inevitably deteriorate the nobler elements in their emotion. Give abnormal love the same chance as normal love, subject it to the wholesome control of public opinion, allow it to be self-respecting, draw it from dark slums into the light of day, strike off its chains and set it free, and I am confident, says Ulrich, that it will exhibit analogous virtues, checkered of course by analogous vices, to those with which you are familiar in the mutual love of male and female. The slave has of necessity a slavish soul. The way to elevate is to emancipate him. All that may be true, replies the objector. It is even possible that society will take the hard case of your Urnings into consideration, and listen to their bitter cry. But in the meanwhile, supposing these inverted instincts to be inborn, supposing them to be irrepressible and incontrovertible, supposing them to be less dirty and nasty than they are commonly considered, is it not the plain duty of the individual to suppress them, so long as the law of his country condemns them? No, rejoins Ulrichs, 1,000 times no. It is only the ignorant antipathy of the majority which renders such law as you speak of possible. Go to the best books of medical jurisprudence, go to the best authorities on psychical deviations from the normal type. You will find that these support me in my main contention. These, though hostile in their sentiments and chilled by natural repugnance, have a respect for science, and they agree with me in saying that the Urning came into this world an Urning, and must remain till the end of his life an Urning still. To deal with him according to your code is no less monstrous than if you were to punish the colour blind, or the deaf and dumb, or albinos, or crooked back cripples. Very well, answers the objector, but I will quote the words of an eloquent living writer, and appeal to your generous instincts and your patriotism. Professor Dowden observes that self-surrender is at times sternly enjoined, and if the egoistic desires are brought into conflict with social duties, the individual life and joy within us, at whatever cost of personal suffering, must be sacrificed to the just claims of our fellows. What have you to say to that? In the first place, replies Ulrichs, I demur in this case to the phrases egoistic desires, social duties, just claims of our fellows. I maintain that in trying to rehabilitate men of my own stamp, and to justify their natural right to toleration, I am not egoistic. It is begging the question to stigmatise their inborn desire as selfish. The social duties of which you speak are not duties, but compliances to law framed in blindness and prejudice. The claims of our fellows to which you appeal are not just, but cruelly iniquitous. My insurgence against all these things makes me act indeed as an innovator, and I may be condemned, as a consequence of my rashness, to persecution, exile, defamation, proscription. But let me remind you that Christ was crucified, and that he is now regarded as a benefactor. Stop, breaks in the objector. We need not bring most sacred names into this discussion. I admit that innovators have done the greatest service to society, but you have not proved that you are working for the salvation of humanity at large. Would it not be better to remain quiet and to sacrifice your life and joy, the life and joy of an avowed minority, for the sake of the immense majority who cannot tolerate you, and who dread your innovation? The Catholic priesthood is vowed to celibacy, and unquestionably there are some adult men in that order who have trampled out the imperious appetite of the male for the female. What they do for the sake of their vow will not you accomplish, when you have so much of good to gain, of evil to escape? What good, what evil? Rejoins Ulrichs. You are again begging the question, and now you are making appeals to my selfishness, my personal desire for tranquillity, my wish to avoid persecution and shame. I have taken no vow of celibacy. If I have taken any vow at all, it is to fight for the rights of an innocent, harmless, downtrodden group of outraged personalities. The cross of a crusade is sewn upon the sleeve of my right arm. To expect from me and from my fellows the renouncement voluntarily undertaken by a Catholic priest is an absurdity, when we join no order, have no faith to uphold, no ecclesiastical system to support. We maintain that we have the right to exist after the fashion in which nature made us, and if we cannot alter your laws, we shall go on breaking them. You may condemn us to infamy, exile, prison, as you formerly burned witches. You may degrade our emotional instincts and drive us into vice and misery. But you will not eradicate inverted sexuality. Expel nature with a fork, and you know what happens. That is enough, says the objector. We had better close this conversation. I am sorry for you. sorry that you will not yield to sense and force. The Urning must be punished. End of chapter 7, part 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 8, part 1 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 8, Literature, Idealistic, Part 1. To speak of Walt Whitman at all in connection with Ulrichs and sexual inversion seems paradoxical. At the outset it must be definitely stated that he has nothing to do with anomalous, abnormal, vicious, or diseased forms of the emotion which males entertain for males. Yet no man in the modern world has expressed so strong a conviction that manly attachment, athletic love, the high towering love of comrades, is a main factor in human life, a virtue upon which society will have to rest, and a passion equal in its permanence and intensity to sexual affection. He assumes, without raising the question, that the love of man for man coexists with the love of man for woman in one and the same individual. The relation of the two modes of feeling is clearly stated in this poem. Fast anchored, eternal, O love! O woman I love! O bride, O wife! More resistless than I can tell. The thought of you then separate, as disembodied, or another born, ethereal, the last athletic reality, my consolation. I ascend, I float in the regions of your love, O man, O sharer of my roving life. Neuropathical Urnings are not hinted at in any passage of his works. As his friend and commentator Mr. Burroughs puts it, the sentiment is primitive, athletic, taking form in all manner of large and homely out-of-door images, and springs, as any one may see, directly from the heart and experience of the poet. This being so, Whitman never suggests that comradeship may occasion the development of physical desires. But then he does not in set terms condemn these desires, or warn his disciples against them. To a Western boy he says, "If you be not silently selected by lovers, and do not silently seek lovers, of what use is it that you seek to become élève of mine?" Like Plato in the Phaedrus, Whitman describes an enthusiastic type of masculine emotion, leaving its private details to the moral sense and special inclination of the person concerned. The language of Calamus, that section of Leaves of Grass which is devoted to the gospel of comradeship, has a passionate glow, a warmth of emotional tone, beyond anything to which the modern world is used in the celebration of the love of friends. It recalls to our mind the early Greek enthusiasm, that fellowship in arms which flourished among Dorian tribes, and made a chivalry for prehistoric Hellas. Nor does the poet himself appear to be unconscious that there are dangers and difficulties involved in the highly pitched emotions he is praising. The whole tenor of two mysterious compositions, entitled "Whoever You Are, Holding Me Now in Hand," and "Trickle, Drops," suggests an underlying sense of spiritual conflict. The following poem, again, is sufficiently significant and typical to call for literal transcription. Earth, my likeness, though you look so impressive, ample, and spheric here, I now suspect that is not all. I now suspect there is something fierce in you, eligible to burst forth. For an athletic is enamoured of me, and I of him. But toward him there is something fierce and terrible in me, eligible to burst forth. I dare not tell it in words, not even in these songs. The reality of Whitman's feeling, the intense delight which he derives from the personal presence and physical contact of a beloved man, find expression in A Glimpse, Recorders Ages Hence, When I Heard at the Close of Day, I saw in Louisiana a live oak growing. Long I thought that knowledge alone would content me. O tan-faced prairie boy, and vigil strange I kept on the field one night. It is clear, then, that in his treatment of comradeship, or the impassioned love of man for man, Whitman has struck a keynote to the emotional intensity of which the modern world is unaccustomed. It therefore becomes of much importance to discover the poet-prophet's Stimmung, his radical instinct with regard to the moral quality of feeling he encourages. Studying his works by their own light, and by the light of their author's character, interpreting each part by reference to the whole, and in the spirit of the whole, an impartial critic will, I think, be drawn to the conclusion that what he calls the adhesiveness of comradeship is meant to have no interblending with the amativeness of sexual love. Personally, it is undeniable that Whitman possesses a specially keen sense of the fine restraint and continence, the cleanliness and chastity that are inseparable from the perfectly virile and physically complete nature of healthy manhood. Still, we may predicate the same ground qualities in the early Dorians, those martial founders of the institution of Greek love. And it is notorious to students of Greek civilization that the lofty sentiment of their chivalry was intertwined with singular anomalies in its historical development. To remove all doubt about Whitman's own intentions when he composed Calamus, and promulgated his doctrine of impassioned comradeship, I wrote to him, frankly posing the questions which perplexed my mind. The answer I received, dated Camden, New Jersey, USA, August 19th, 1890, and which he permits me to make use of, puts the matter beyond all debate, and confirms the conclusions to which I had been led by criticism. He writes as follows: "About the questions on Calamus, etc., they quite daze me. Leaves of Grass is only to be rightly construed by and within its own atmosphere and essential character, all its pages and pieces so coming strictly under. That the Calamus part has ever allowed the possibility of such construction as mentioned is terrible. I am fain to hope the pages themselves are not to be even mentioned for such gratuitous and quite at the time undreamed and unwished possibility of morbid inferences, which are disavowed by me and seem damnable." No one who knows anything about Walt Whitman will for a moment doubt his candour and sincerity. Therefore, the man who wrote Calamus, and preached the gospel of comradeship, entertains feelings at least as hostile to sexual inversion as any law-abiding humdrum Anglo-Saxon could desire. It is obvious that he has not even taken the phenomena of abnormal instinct into account. else he must have foreseen that, human nature being what it is, we cannot expect to eliminate all sexual alloy from emotions raised to a high pitch of passionate intensity, and that permanent elements within the midst of our society will imperil the absolute purity of the ideal he attempts to establish. These considerations do not, however, affect the spiritual nature of that ideal. After acknowledging, what Whitman has omitted to perceive, that there are inevitable points of contact between sexual inversion and his doctrine of comradeship, the question now remains whether he has not suggested the way whereby abnormal instincts may be moralised and raised to higher value. In other words, are those instincts provided in Calamus with the means of their salvation from the filth and mire of brutal appetite? It is difficult to answer this question, for the issue involved is nothing less momentous than the possibility of evoking a new chivalrous enthusiasm, analogous to that of primitive Hellenic society, from emotions which are at present classified among the turpitudes of human nature. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 8, Part 2 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 8. Literature Idealistic. Part 2. Let us look a little closer at the expression which Whitman has given to his own feelings about friendship. The first thing that strikes us is the mystic emblem he has chosen for masculine love. That is the water plant or scented rush called calamus, which springs in wild places, in paths untrodden, in the growth by margins of pond waters. He has chosen these emblematic and capricious blades because of their shyness, their aromatic perfume, their aloofness from the patent life of the world. He calls them sweet leaves, pink-tinged roots, timid leaves, scented herbage of my breast. Finally he says, "Hear my last words, and the most baffling. Hear the frailest leaves of me, and yet my strongest lasting. Here I shade down and hide my thoughts, I do not expose them, and yet they expose me more than all my other poems." The manliness of the emotion, which is thus so shyly, mystically indicated, appears in the magnificent address to soldiers at the close of the Great War. Over the carnage rose prophetic a voice. Its tenderness emerges in the elegy on a slain comrade. Vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding. Vigil for comrade swiftly slain. Vigil I never forget, how as day brightened I rose from the chill ground, and folded my soldier well in his blanket, and buried him where he fell. Its pathos and clinging intensity transpire through the first lines of the following piece, which may have been suggested by the legends of David and Jonathan, Achilles and Patroclus, Orestes and Pylades. When I pursue the conquered fame of heroes, and the victories of mighty generals, I do not envy the generals, nor the president in his presidency, nor the rich in his great house. But when I read of the brotherhood of lovers, how it was with them, how through life, through dangers, odium, unchanging long and long, through youth and through middle and old age, how unfaltering, how affectionate and faithful they were, then I am pensive. I hastily put down the book and walk away, filled with the bitterest envy. But Whitman does not conceive of comradeship as a merely personal possession, delightful to the friends it links in bonds of amity. He regards it essentially as a social and political virtue. This human emotion is destined to cement society and to render commonwealths inviolable. Reading some of his poems, we are carried back to ancient Greece, to Plato's Symposium, to Philip gazing on the sacred band of Thebans after the fight at Chaeronea. I dreamed in a dream I saw a city invincible to the attacks of the whole of the rest of the earth. I dreamed that was the new city of friends. Nothing was greater there than the quality of robust love. It led the rest. It was seen every hour in the actions of the men of that city, and in all their looks and words. And again, I believe the main purport of these states is to found a superb friendship, exalté, previously unknown, because I perceive it waits and has been always waiting, latent in all men. And once again, come, I will make the continent indissoluble. I will make the most splendid race the sun ever yet shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands, with the love of comrades, with the lifelong love of comrades. I will plant companionship thick as trees all along the shores of America, and among the shores of the Great Lakes, and all over the prairies. I will make inseparable cities, with their arms about each other's necks. By the love of comrades, by the manly love of comrades. For you these from me, O democracy, to serve you, ma femme. For you I am thrilling these songs. In the company of Walt Whitman we are very far away from Gibbon and Carlier, from Tardieu and Caspar Liemann, from Krafft-Ebing and Ulrichs. What indeed has this superb friendship, exalté, previously unknown, which waits and has been always waiting, latent in all men? That something fierce in me eligible to burst forth? Ethereal comradeship, the last athletic reality. What has all this in common with the painful topic of the preceding sections of my essay? It has this in common with it. Whitman recognises among the sacred emotions and social virtues, destined to regenerate political life and to cement nations, an intense, jealous, throbbing, sensitive, expectant love of man for man, a love which yearns in absence, droops under the sense of neglect, revives at the return of the beloved, a love that finds honest delight in hand-touch, meeting lips, hours of privacy, close personal contact. He proclaims this love to be not only a daily fact in the present, but also a saving and ennobling aspiration. While he expressly repudiates, disowns, and brands as damnable all morbid inferences which may be drawn by malevolence or vicious cunning from his doctrine, he is prepared to extend the gospel of comradeship to the whole human race. He expects democracy, the new social and political medium, the new religious ideal of mankind, to develop and extend that fervid comradeship, and by its means to counterbalance and to spiritualise what is vulgar and materialistic in the modern world. Democracy, he maintains, infers such loving comradeship as its most inevitable twin or counterpart, without which it will be incomplete, in vain, and incapable of perpetuating itself. If this be not a dream, if he is right in believing that threads of manly friendship, fond and loving, pure and sweet, strong and lifelong, carried to degrees hitherto unknown, will penetrate the organism of society, not only giving tone to individual character, and making it unprecedentedly emotional, muscular, heroic, and refined, but having deepest relations to general politics, then are we perhaps justified in foreseeing here the advent of an enthusiasm which shall rehabilitate those outcast instincts by giving them a spiritual atmosphere, an environment of recognised and healthy emotions, wherein to expand at liberty, and purge away the grossness and the madness of their pariahdom. This prospect, like all ideals, until they are realised in experience, may seem fantastically visionary. Moreover, the substance of human nature is so mixed that it would perhaps be fanatical to expect from Whitman's chivalry of adhesiveness a more immaculate purity than was attained by the mediaeval chivalry of amativeness. Still, that mediaeval chivalry, the great emotional product of feudalism, though it fell short of its own aspiration, bequeathed incalculable good to modern society by refining and clarifying the crudest of male appetites. In like manner, the democratic chivalry announced by Whitman may be destined to absorb, control, and elevate those darker, more mysterious, apparently abnormal appetites, which we have seen to be widely diffused and ineradicable in the groundwork of human nature. Returning from the dream, the vision of a future possibility, it will at any rate be conceded that Whitman has founded comradeship, the enthusiasm which binds man to man in fervent love, upon a natural basis. Eliminating classical associations of corruption, ignoring the perplexed questions of a guilty passion doomed by law and popular antipathy to failure, he begins anew with sound and primitive humanity. There he discovers a superb friendship, exalté, previously unknown. He perceives that it waits, and has been always waiting, latent in all men. His method of treatment, fearless and uncowed by any thought of evil, his touch upon the matter, chaste and wholesome and aspiring, reveal the possibility of restoring in all innocence to human life a portion of its alienated or unclaimed moral birthright. The aberrations we have been discussing in this treatise are perhaps the morbid symptoms of suppression, of hypertrophy, or ignorant misregulation, in a genuine emotion capable of being raised to good by sympathetic treatment. It were well to close upon this note. The half, as the Greeks said, is more than the whole, and the time has not yet come to raise the question whether the love of man for man shall be elevated through a hitherto unapprehended chivalry to nobler powers, even as the barbarous love of man for woman once was. This question at the present moment is deficient in actuality. The world cannot be invited to entertain it. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 9 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The conclusions to which I am led by this inquiry into sexual inversion are that its several manifestations may be classified under the following categories. 1. Forced abstinence from intercourse with females, or faute de mieux. 2. Wantonness and curious seeking after novel pleasure. 3. Pronounced morbidity. 4. Inborn instinctive preference for the male and indifference to the female sex. 5. Epochs of history when the habit has become established and endemic in whole nations. Under the first category we group the phenomena presented by schools, prisons, convents, ships, garrisons in solitary stations, nomadic tribes of marauding conquerors. To the second belong those individuals who amuse themselves with experiments in sensual pleasure, men jaded with ordinary sexual indulgence and indifferent voluptuaries. It is possible that something morbid or abnormal usually marks this class. To the third we assign clear cases of hereditary malady, in which a want of self-control is prominent, together with sufferers from nervous lesion, wounds, epilepsy, senile brain softening, in so far as these physical disturbances are complicated with abnormal passions. The fourth includes the whole class of Urnings, who have been hitherto ignored by medical investigators, and on whose numerical importance Ulrichs has perhaps laid exaggerated stress. These individuals behave precisely like persons of normal sexual proclivities, display no signs of insanity, and have no morbid constitutional diathesis to account for their peculiarity. Under the existing conditions of European society, these four categories exist sporadically. That is to say, the members of them are found scattered through all communities, but are nowhere recognised except by the penal code and the medical profession. In the fifth category we are brought face to face with the problem offered by ancient Hellas, by Persia, by Afghan, by the peoples of what Burton calls the Sotadic zone. However we may account for the origin of sexual inversion, the instinct has, through usage, tradition, and social toleration, passed here into the nature of the race, so that the four previous categories are confounded, or, if distinguished, are only separable in the same way as the vicious and morbid affections of the ordinary sexual appetite may be differentiated from its healthier manifestations. Returning to the first four categories, which alone have any importance for a modern European, we perceive that only one of them, the third, is positively morbid, and only one, the second, is ipso facto vicious. The first is immoral in the same sense as all incontinence, including self-abuse, fornication, and so forth, practised faute de mieux, is immoral. But it cannot be called either morbid or positively vicious, because the habit in question springs up under extra-social circumstances. The members of the fourth category are abnormal through their constitution. Whether we refer that abnormality to atavism, or to some hitherto unapprehended deviation from the rule in their sexual conformation, there is no proof that they are the subjects of disease. At the same time, it is certain that they are not deliberately vicious. The treatment of sexual inversion by society and legislation follows the view taken of its origin and nature. Ever since the age of Justinian, it has been regarded as an unqualified crime against God, the order of the world, and the state. This opinion, which has been incorporated in the codes of all the Occidental races, sprang originally from the conviction that sterile passions are injurious to the tribe by checking propagation. Religion adopted this view, and through the legend of Sodom and Gomorrah taught that God was ready to punish whole nations with violent destruction if they practised the unmentionable vice. Advancing civilization, at the same time, sought in every way to limit and regulate the sexual appetite, and while doing so, it naturally excluded those forms which were not agreeable to the majority, which possessed no obvious utility, and which prima facie seemed to violate the cardinal laws of human nature. Social feeling, moulded by religion, by legislation, by civility, and by the persistent antipathies of the majority, regards sexual inversion with immitigable abhorrence. It does not distinguish between the categories I have indicated, but includes all species under the common condemnation of crime. Meanwhile, of late years, we have come to perceive that the phenomena presented by sexual inversion cannot be so roughly dealt with. Two great nations, the French and the Italian, by the Code Napoleon and the Codice Penale of 1889, remove these phenomena from the category of crime into that of immorality at worst. That is to say, they place the intercourse of males with males upon the same legal ground as the normal sexual relation. They punish violence, protect minors, and provide for the maintenance of public decency. Within these limitations, they recognise the right of adults to deal as they choose with their persons. The new school of anthropologists and psychological physicians study sexual inversion partly on the lines of historical evolution, and partly from the point of view of disease. Mixing up atavism and heredity with nervous malady in the individual, they wish to substitute medical treatment for punishment, lifelong sequestration in asylums for terms of imprisonment differing in duration according to the offence. Neither society nor science entertains the notion that those instincts which the laws of France and Italy tolerate, under certain restrictions, can be simply natural in a certain percentage of male persons. Up to the present time, the Urning has not been considered as a sport of nature in her attempt to differentiate the sexes. Ulrichs is the only European who has maintained this view, in a long series of polemical and imperfectly scientific works. Yet facts brought daily beneath the notice of open-eyed observers prove that Ulrichs is justified in his main contention. Society lies under the spell of ancient terrorism and coagulated errors. Science is either wilfully hypocritical or radically misinformed. Walt Whitman in America regards what he calls manly love as destined to be a leading virtue of democratic nations, and the source of a new chivalry. but he does not define what he means by manly love, and he emphatically disavows any morbid inferences from his doctrine as damnable. This is how the matter stands now. The one thing which seems clear is that sexual inversion is no subject for legislation, and that the example of France and Italy might well be followed by other nations. The problem ought to be left to the physician, the moralist, the educator, and finally to the operation of social opinion. End of chapter 9. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 10 of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 10. Suggestions on the subject of sexual inversion in relation to law and education. 1. The laws in force against what are called unnatural offences derive from an edict of Justinian, Anno Domini 538. The emperor treated these offences as criminal, on the ground that they brought plagues, famines, earthquakes, and the destruction of whole cities, together with their inhabitants, upon the nations who tolerated them. 2. A belief that sexual inversion is a crime against God, nature, and the state pervades all subsequent legislation on the subject. This belief rests on 1. Theological conceptions derived from the Scriptures. 2. A dread of decreasing the population. 3. The antipathy of the majority for the tastes of the minority. 4. The vulgar error that antiphysical desires are invariably voluntary, and the result either of inordinate lust or of satiated appetites. 3. Scientific investigation has proved in recent years that a very large proportion of persons in whom abnormal sexual inclinations are manifested possess them from their earliest childhood, that they cannot divert them into normal channels, and that they are powerless to get rid of them. In these cases, then, legislation is interfering with the liberty of individuals, under a certain misconception regarding the nature of their offence. 4. Those who support the present laws are therefore bound to prove that the coercion, punishment, and defamation of such persons are justified either 1. By any injury which these persons suffer in health of body or mind, or 2. By any serious danger arising from them to the social organism. 5. Experience, confirmed by scientific observation, proves that the temperate indulgence of abnormal sexuality is no more injurious to the individual than a similar indulgence of normal sexuality. 6. In the present state of overpopulation, it is not to be apprehended that a small minority of men exercising sterile and abnormal sexual inclinations should seriously injure society by limiting the increase of the human race. 7. Legislation does not interfere with various forms of sterile intercourse between men and women. 1. Prostitution. 2. Cohabitation in marriage during the period of pregnancy. 3. Artificial precautions against impregnation. And 4. Some abnormal modes of congress with the consent of the female. It is therefore in an illogical position when it interferes with the action of those who are naturally sterile, on the ground of maintaining the numerical standard of the population. 8. the danger that unnatural vices, if tolerated by the law, would increase until whole nations acquired them, does not seem to be formidable. The position of women in our civilization renders sexual relations among us Occidentals different from those of any country, ancient Greece and Rome, modern Turkey and Persia, where anti-physical habits have hitherto become endemic. 9. In modern France, since the promulgation of the Code Napoleon, sexual inversion has been tolerated under the same restrictions as normal sexuality. That is to say, violence and outrages to public decency are punished, and minors are protected. But adults are allowed to dispose as they like of their own persons. The experience of nearly a century shows that in France, where sexual inversion is not criminal per se, there has been no extension of it through society. Competent observers, like agents of police, declare that London, in spite of our penal legislation, is no less notorious for abnormal vice than Paris. 10. Italy, by the Penal Code of 1889, adopted the principles of the Code Napoleon on this point. It would be interesting to know what led to this alteration of the Italian law, but it cannot be supposed that the results of the Code Napoleon in France were not fully considered. 11. The severity of the English statutes render them almost incapable of being put in force. In consequence of this, the law is not unfrequently evaded, and crimes are winked at. 12. At the same time, our laws encourage blackmailing upon false accusation, and the presumed evasion of their execution places from time to time a vile weapon in the hands of unscrupulous politicians to attack the government in office. Examples: the Dublin Castle scandals of 1884, the Cleveland Street scandals of 1889. 13. Those who hold that our penal laws are required by the interests of society must turn their attention to the higher education. This still rests on the study of the Greek and Latin classics, a literature impregnated with paederastia. It is carried on at public schools, where young men are kept apart from females, and where homosexual vices are frequent. The best minds of our youth are therefore exposed to the influences of a pederastic literature at the same time that they acquire the knowledge and experience of unnatural practices. Nor is any trouble taken to correct these adverse influences by physiological instruction in the laws of sex. 14. The points suggested for consideration are whether England is still justified in restricting the freedom of adult persons, and rendering certain abnormal forms of sexuality criminal, by any real dangers to society, after it has been shown: 1. That abnormal inclinations are congenital, natural, and ineradicable in a large percentage of individuals. 2. That we tolerate sterile intercourse of various types between the two sexes. 3. That our legislation has not suppressed the immorality in question. 4. That the operation of the Code Napoleon for nearly a century has not increased this immorality in France. 5. That Italy, with the experience of the Code Napoleon to guide her, adopted its principles in 1889. 6. That the English penalties are rarely inflicted to their full extent. 7. That their existence encourages blackmailing, and their non-enforcement gives occasion for base political agitation. 8. that our higher education is in open contradiction to the spirit of our laws. Finis. End of chapter 10. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. End of A Problem in Modern Ethics by John Addington Symonds.